Hey everybody, welcome back. Happy New Year. It's 2023. Welcome to another semester of fun and adventure in LD/PF debate here on Hail State Debate. I'm Brett Harvey, Ben, Sam, and Olivia's dad, for those of you in Mississippi, and also the coach here of the Mississippi State debate team. And we're looking at a really interesting LD topic for the January-February topic. It is resolved. Justice requires open borders for human migration. As always, we want this to be helpful to you, so the timestamps and the sources will be in the notes below. Social media links for our team, if you want to learn more about us, are there as well. If it's helpful, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell a friend. And without further ado, let's jump right in and talk about some initial thoughts. So I think it's a great topic. I think the LD topic committee has been on a roll. It's kind of a stark contrast to the PF topic because it's like a clear, self-contained idea, a concept of open borders for migration that you can easily wrap your brain around and understand. But then once you have a basic understanding of it, you have a ton of different options: philosophical, economic, critical theory, political theory, and other options of where you can go with this topic, and you can combine them in one case, and you need to be at least a little bit fluent on all of them. But that's what a good topic does. It's narrow enough that you don't have to devote your entire life to just understanding it. Again, kind of like the PF topic we have right now. But it also gives you plenty of room for creativity. So I would just say like A+ job to the topic committee on this one. In terms of balance between the sides, I would say I think the topic defaults a little bit to being pro-negative because of the words justice requires. I think those two words together are a very high hurdle to get over, and it means you have to do more than just show that open borders are a good idea, but that they link to some fundamental concept of like what people are entitled to as a basic matter of justice. But on the other hand, if AF can win a few key framing battles, it is right back in the hunt. It's a pretty balanced resolution because there are some strong empirical and moral arguments on the side of open borders and a lot of good literature. One word of caution would be it's a topic where you need to be sensitive to the language you use and the interests of both sides, both the legitimate interests of, for example, migrants and the hardships that they face, but also the concerns, for example, of like blue-collar workers in destination countries. Anyway, there is a ton to cover here, so let's jump right in. So hopefully we can get this done under maybe an hour and 15 minutes or so. We'll start by looking at factual background, then definitions, then values and criteria, then AF arguments, then neg arguments, and then wrap up as usual with some final thoughts. Okay, so factual background. Like I said, I think this is a pretty self-contained conceptual topic, but it's always useful to have a little bit of background on what we're talking about, so we have some shared vocabulary for the rest of the video. And so, you sound like you're smart and you know what you're talking about in debate rounds. So debates about immigration and restrictions on migration are as old as the idea of nation states and borders themselves. Humans are a migratory species. We have been seeking out better conditions for ourselves and our descendants in new locations around the world since like back to the Paleolithic era, as long as we've been human, and even before that, right? In more recent history, as nation states have become better defined politically and socially in the 19th and 20th centuries, they've tended to impose more restrictions on immigration for reasons of national identity, economic advantage, and to be frank, in many cases, just prejudice. Today, the idea of open borders, that is unrestricted movement into a country by non-citizens and non-nationals, is seen as a pretty extreme and radical position. That's why, as the World Population Review notes, as of 2022, no country in the world has a policy of formally open borders. Now, to be fair, historically, this wasn't always the case. Open borders, at least in practice, weren't really that radical an idea that long ago. For example, as a George Mason law professor Ilyas Omin notes, from the founding in 1787 of the United States and almost a century thereafter, the U.S. had what he calls a virtual open borders policy. We had this massive constantly expanding country, and we were literally just trying to fill it up with people and to inhabit it, and there was no effective way to police the borders, and there was really no desire to. But when you fast forward into the 21st century, what we see is that migration and immigration are just as important as ever, maybe more contentious than ever. Why? Well, there are a lot of reasons that we'll talk about throughout the video, but the big overarching theme is that the world is effectively getting smaller, right? The global population just hit 8 billion people. We are connected digitally in ways that we couldn't imagine 100 years ago. People are more mobile than they were and able to migrate far more quickly and easily than they were before. We also live in a world where the differences between countries are getting bigger and the gaps between the haves and the have-nots are getting wider. And to help us visualize just how wide those wealth gaps are, here is a nifty chart from Jeff Desjardins, I think that's how you say it, a visual capitalist, showing the share of global wealth by country. And since we just finished up the World Cup, it is perhaps appropriately sort of like a soccer ball. Now, if you look this over, what you'll see, right, is that the United States represents about 4.25% of global population, but owns more than a quarter, 29.9% of all the world's wealth. Europe and North America have about 15% of the world's overall population, but own about half of its wealth. Africa, by contrast, has about the same percentage of global population, 16%, but owns this tiny little purple spot over here on the side, which is less than 1% of the world's wealth. And outside of the US, Europe, China, Japan, India, and a handful of other major powers, the entire rest of the world shares this tiny little sliver over here on the left. So try to imagine for a second that you're living outside one of these wealthier countries and your economic opportunity is dramatically limited by the random accident of where you were born. You see on TV and on social media, like regular Americans, regular Europeans, and others enjoying levels of affluence that you could probably never achieve in your home country. Are you going to just resign yourself to your fate and accept it? You know, what if, as part of the bargain, you're living in a country that oppresses you because of your race or your religion or your gender or your sexual orientation? What if you look around and things are getting worse because of, say, political instability or climate change? You know, a lot of people in those situations very understandably say, look, you know, I don't have any obligation just because of your laws and your arbitrary borders that you drew on a map to sit here and let my life go by without trying to do better for myself and my family, legally or illegally, if we want to put it those terms, crossing borders, which is part of the reason why international migration is at historical highs for the modern era. If you take a look at this chart from the Migration Policy Institute in 2022, you'll see that both as a percentage of global population and in absolute terms, the number of people living outside of their country of origin has not been higher in recent history. 280 million people, close to 4% of the world's population, or nearly the entire population of the US, are migrants. If they were their own country, they would be the fourth largest country in the world. We'll talk about this later, but this reality of massive global migration, fueled by factors like economic inequality, political unrest, war, climate, and so on, has resulted in a wide array of responses from recipient countries, ranging from extremely laudable humanitarian efforts by some countries like Germany to absorb as many refugees as possible during a crisis, to the demonizing and scapegoating of migrants that we see, for example, from the Trump movement in the United States. So migration is a big deal. And because of the high stakes, as well as the serious philosophical questions about things like our duty to other people, the right to associate, the right to exclude, what is the just response to historical injustice, because of all these things, there is a huge body of literature on all of the moral and economic and other facets of immigration. Open borders, in particular, represent basically one endpoint of the academic debate. Proponents of open borders say that the whole system of confining people based on their birth and their citizenship and their residency is illegitimate and needs to be scrapped entirely in favor of a more or less free and open movement of people, or at least free migration. No country in the world has adopted open borders as a formal policy, and many view it as an impossible utopian dream. Now, to be clear, some have adopted essentially open borders within a limited group of countries, like essentially the European Union. That certainly is the case, but none for essentially the entire population of the world. So for the entire population of the world, letting anyone in who wants to come in 2001, the Globe and Mail, for example, called it a utopian madhouse, even crazier in concept than communism. Now, however you feel about that does reflect what a lot of people think about it. But some have gotten fairly close, or at least implemented more open borders with certain neighboring countries and had pretty good results, which suggests that maybe it's not such a radical idea after all. And as we'll see, there are compelling philosophical and practical arguments in favor of open borders, as well as strong common sense and empirical objections to them, particularly given the strong wording of the resolution, which again doesn't just say open borders are good, but rather that justice requires them. Okay, so next let's talk about definitions, values, and criteria. And we start with the definitions as usual. The first term we have jumping right out at you is justice. We're going to spend more time on this in just a minute when we actually talk about the criteria and framing like what justice means. But for now, let's just make one quick observation about how the term justice impacts the debate. Justice is notoriously hard to define, but most people agree it has something to do with fundamental rights and giving people what they're due as opposed to just like calculating net costs and benefits. For example, the Cambridge Dictionary defines it this way: justice is fairness in the way people are dealt with. So what this means, as a default at least, is that most arguments on this topic are probably going to tilt toward fundamental rights type arguments as opposed to just pure raw utilitarian cost benefit analysis arguments. And this is important because there actually are a lot of very robust utilitarian economics based arguments out there in the literature about open borders. There's a case, for example, that open borders would let skilled labor flow to where it's most needed and dramatically raise global GDP, which of course we'll talk about later. And you certainly can still use these types of practical utilitarian arguments, but you just need to be mindful, and this is very important, of linking them to some clear conception of fundamental justice as opposed to just talking about how this is generically good or it would generically be like nice to do this. So the next term is required. And I would say that requires is arguably the most important term, certainly at least the second most important term in the resolution for a couple of reasons. First, the word requires is important because it creates a singular absolute requirement. And I know it's kind of circular, but think about it. We are not merely saying that open borders are desirable, laudable, or moral, but rather that they are the only just state that can exist. Cambridge defines requires this way. To require is to need something or to make something necessary. In other words, it's necessary. It's a prerequisite. It's a necessary condition. Most definitions are going to say something similar to this. If A requires B, then you cannot have A without B. In other words, again, it's a necessary condition. And what that means is that any country under this resolution that does not have open borders for immigration is by definition not just unwise or maybe not optimal, but unjust, fundamentally unjust. And that opens up an avenue of attack for the neg that I usually think is kind of abusive, but in this case, arguably is warranted by the wording of the resolution. And that is to say that the app has to prove an absolute. And if I, as the neg, can give you a handful of examples of exceptions where, for example, justice permits a non-open border, even if you think open borders generally are the right thing, if I can poke a few holes and show you that there are some cases where non-open borders can exist and they're not unjust, then I should win the round. Anyway, the app obviously wants to push back pretty hard on this idea that it has to advocate for a categorical rule. And there are a couple of ways that the app can do that. The first is with the definition. There are dictionary definitions of require that sound a lot less absolute than if not A, then no B, that formulation we mentioned earlier. For example, one definition of require from Webster is to call for as suitable or appropriate. Well, suitable or appropriate seems like a much easier bar to get over than absolutely necessary. So it's going to be a good idea for the AF to use a definition like this to start the process of pushing back on this notion of an absolute categorical rule. And there are other ways you can do that we'll talk about in just a few minutes, but that is a key starting point for the AF to sort of reject the notion that in every single case it has to prove that open borders are the only acceptable course. Now, another big issue raised by the word requires is the question required of whom exactly? The resolution doesn't specify an actor. Now, we can safely presume that in any given country, the actor will probably be the central or the federal government because that's normally who sets immigration policy and enforces the borders. But the real question isn't like which part of the government, it's how many countries are we talking about? How many borders have to be open for the resolution to be affirmed? All of them? Most of them, just maybe the key ones that a lot of people seem to want to cross, like the ones into rich countries, like the southern border of the United States, like certain borders into the European Union. In other words, does AF have to defend a world in which literally every national border must be open and none of them can be closed or restricted? Or can AF win by saying as long as some open borders exist, maybe in like certain key places, that is sufficient to win the round? And the fact that others might be closed doesn't keep us from affirming. Well, in terms of like linguistic interpretation, just looking at the wording of the resolution, we have made the argument on this channel before that when a resolution uses what's called a bare plural, in this case, open borders, that is a plural noun or a noun phrase with no qualifier like some, most, or all, that the correct default interpretation of that bare plural here, open borders, at least for a rule-based statement like a debate resolution, is that it is referring to every member of the class described. So in this case, it would be referring to essentially every border. And we'll link to a prior video with a timestamp if you want to review that discussion, as well as some other sources discussing bare plurals if you really want to drill down on this. But long story short, what that would mean here is that the AF would be locked into defending a world in which no country's borders, maybe absent exigent circumstances like a war or a pandemic, could ever be restricted. So if you're AF, you really want to take the position that the resolution doesn't require all borders to be open. It just says justice requires open borders. So for example, if it said, justice requires that we provide food for the hungry, that doesn't mean you have to provide every type of food. It just means you have to provide food. So AF may want to argue that, a world with a significant number of open borders is all that the resolution requires. And so you can maybe advocate that certain rich countries do it, the United States, the European Union, because it is a little bit tougher to argue that poorer countries, in developing parts of the world that may be unable to absorb immigrants, that may be worried about their culture being subsumed and overrun by larger groups of people, have the same obligations as, say, the United States or the European Union. So the next term is really important as well, and that's, of course, open borders. The key issue in defining open borders is going to be how absolutely open do they have to be in order to be topical and meet the requirements of the resolution. The neg is going to want to point to common sense concerns like health issues, preventing disease transmission, keeping out known criminals, preventing terrorism, and just the general ability to sort of screen for these things in incoming migrants. In other words, neg wants a more absolute definition of open borders that's harder to defend, so it can say, no, we have to reject this to be able to do even the most basic things like public health. Whereas AF wants a more moderate, reasonable definition that allows for some common sense exceptions, but still is categorized as an open border and something that will affirm. So to start on the negative side, then the Wikipedia definition echoes this kind of fairly absolute view. It says an open border is a border that enables free movement of people and often of goods between jurisdictions with no restrictions on movement and is lacking substantive border control. Well, that's very, very aggressive. That means essentially we don't even have the means to check and see who you are or whether you have a disease or whether you have committed a crime or something. Columnist Ruben Navarrete echoes this in a 2019 piece talking about open borders, and he says, for me, open means open. There would be no guards, no fencing, no impediments of any kind. Anyone who wants to cross the international boundary for any reason with whatever intent could do so. It would be like it was before May 28th, 1924, the date that the U.S. Border Patrol was formed. Come one, come all. So obviously this kind of definition would be bad for AF. The next line in Navarrete's article is literally, quote, this would be insanity, and that's why no one is calling for it. But under this kind of definition, neg is going to be pointing to nightmare scenarios like pandemics, agents of enemy governments, terrorists, human traffickers, things like that. But luckily for the AF, though, there is some literature that lets them push back and say, no, look, an open border is not necessarily a border that lacks any rules or any controls whatsoever. So first, there's just the Cambridge Dictionary, and it defines an open border as a situation in which goods and people can enter and leave a country easily. Easily is a lot lower bar than without any sort of restriction, without any checking of any kind. If you want a more scholarly card, which might be a good idea because this absolutely could be a definition fight in which the quality of your source matters, there's this from Southwood and Gooden in 2021. As you can see in the first paragraph, they talk about the restrictions you would not have under open borders. But then at the bottom, they have this. Open borders may be compatible with the state continuing to impose and enforce some restrictions, say public health restrictions on would-be immigrants with contagious diseases, and perhaps certain public order restrictions like would-be immigrants who've committed serious criminal offenses. So in other words, AF has some solid ground to push back and say that it doesn't have to defend a total lack of regulation. Like you just have to smile and wave, members of terrorist groups like the Taliban across the border. Well, no, you don't. Common sense can prevail. All we're saying is that aside from exigent circumstances like diseases, serious criminal records, things like that, we shouldn't be impeding the vast majority of people who've done nothing specific wrong and pose no specific problem from migrating to other countries. It should be easy to migrate. Now, speaking of migrating, the last term is human migration. So first of all, I think the reason why the term human was added to the resolution rather than just stopping after, open borders or just putting migration is to narrow the debate to people who are actually seeking to relocate, as opposed to say like commerce. This is not a free trade resolution about like making deliveries of goods across borders and then driving the truck back to the other country. So just remember, if neg gets way off track and starts talking about commercial goods or shipping or businesses or things like that, there's a very easy answer. The word human means no. What we're talking about is people migrating to a new place, not like the shipment of goods. Now, migration is a little bit more tricky. So first of all, there's a major definitional debate about whether migration is necessarily, the word migration means necessarily something that is temporary or something that can be permanent. Collins Dictionary actually has a page spelling out the differences and distinctions between immigration and migration. And what it says on this page, as you can see, is that people who leave their own country to live in another country are called immigrants. But when people migrate, they temporarily move to another place, usually a city or another country, in order to find work. So if the negative were to use this kind of a definition, that would mean we would be narrowing the debate down to something dramatically smaller than what NSDA probably intended, almost to the level of like talking about seasonal workers who go to, like, say, work on a farm and then go back to their country of origin in the off season, as opposed to long-term immigrants, climate refugees, political refugees, and things like that. Now, fortunately, again, for the AF has some options. Most definitions seem to reject this hyper-narrow conception of what migration and migrants are. So, for example, Webster defines migrate as simply to move from one country, place, or locality to another. And it gives an example. In another Bavarian village, 48 out of its total Jewish population of 225 migrated to America between 1834 and 1853, mostly to Cleveland. And it also has the example, thousands of workers migrate to this area in the summer. So Webster is clearly saying here that migrate is just a broader term that encompasses movement of people between areas, whether it's permanent, as in the case of Jewish populations moving from Europe to America, or temporary in terms of seasonal workers. More importantly, actual authorities in the field of immigration tend to share this broader definition of what migrate and migrant specifically means. For example, the UN Migration Agency defines the term migrant this way, as you can see on the screen, is any person who's moving or has moved across an international border within a state away from his habitual place of residence, regardless of legal status, voluntary or involuntary, what the cause is, or what the length of the stay is. One last quick note on definitions is that migration is different from immigration in that migration encompasses movement to different areas or regions within a country, not just different countries, which means that movement between different parts of a country like states or provincial areas would also be topical for debate here. I don't think it's going to be the focus for anybody, but it would be topical. Now, this freedom to move within regions is taken for granted in most countries, particularly in countries like the United States, but it's not the case everywhere. So, for example, China has significant barriers to intra-national movement of, for example, rural residents trying to move to major cities. This is called the Hukou system. I think I pronounced it right. I doubt many cases will focus on intra-national movement, but it is pretty clear that migration does encompass that. So if somebody ran a squirrel case, that is something you'd want to be ready for. So with that, let's take a look at something that's very important on this topic, which is values and criteria. Now, as you probably have heard me say on this channel before, I don't believe in getting super creative with your values, particularly where the topic prescribes a value, like in this case. I think by far the simplest and best approach to values here is to just take justice, because it says it right there in the topic. It's one less thing to worry about, and just roll with that. I think that with this topic, as with most, it's really the criterion that represents the start of the substantive argument and the start of the substantive debate. First of all, in the affirmative, there are a lot of options from the very obvious to the more esoteric. So we start with Rawlsian justice. Rawlsian justice is probably the most basic and natural fit for the AF. It's a good, safe bet for debating this topic on a more traditional LD circuit. Now, briefly, as you probably know if you've been doing LD for a while, Rawls says that we can decide what is just only by placing ourselves behind this imaginary veil of ignorance, where we don't know our place in society. And behind that imaginary veil, we would rationally choose rules and norms that help the least advantage the most, because that would be where we would be at the greatest risk for harm if the dice rolled against us and we ended up there. So when Rawls wrote about distributive justice, he was assuming a single closed society. But if you apply the veil of ignorance idea to your place in the whole of humanity, the whole of the human species, the argument is that you would plainly choose open borders because of the risk of being stuck in an economically depressed or politically repressive country. It is so much greater than maybe having, a little bit of strain on your rich country because of having more immigration or some strains on your social programs or maybe paying higher taxes. And as it turns out, there are some simple layperson-friendly explanations of how to apply Rawls to open borders, including both openborders.info, which is, it's a layperson-friendly site, but I would strongly encourage you to check it out for arguments on the AF, so we'll put a link to that, as well as something from Aditya Bhattacharya, I believe is how you say it, who has a good piece on the Rawlsian case for open immigration. We will link to that as well. So that's Rawls. The next potential criterion is Peter Singer's theories of altruism and obligation. Now, Singer is another 20th century moral philosopher who focused on justice in terms of equity and fairness. He offers this really simple, compelling criterion for almost any resolution that's primarily about helping poor or marginalized people. And it goes like this, and this is a quote. If there is something you can do to help alleviate great suffering of another person without incurring comparable suffering yourself, you have a moral obligation to do it. Now, you get this quote from a 1972 essay called Famine, Affluence, and Morality by Singer, which is one of my favorite cards to run in LD, particularly in more lay judge-friendly places. And we'll pop that up, and you can pause and read it if you want. It's a fantastic block quote from beginning to end, but it's long, so we won't read it all here. Anyway, the case you run from this is the idea that an obligation to help exists, is just, right? If it doesn't cause you comparable harm, it's really simple. You say to the judge, will there perhaps be some downsides for people in richer countries, at least in the short term, from open borders? Yeah, probably so. It might be the case that some wages drop. It might be the case that there's some strain on some social systems. But it's nowhere close to the massive suffering that stems from keeping hopelessly poor people and politically oppressed people stuck in countries where they have no economic opportunity and are being systemically persecuted, right? So that is the basic argument under Singer. Lastly, on the app, there's Robert Nozick's theory of legitimate governmental action. And this is kind of a change of pace. Robert Nozick is a well-known 20th century American philosopher who you could fairly characterize, I think, as being a libertarian. And he really stood as a counterpoint to philosophers like Rawls and Singer in that they conceived of justice as being like whatever state of things achieved less suffering for the marginalized and oppressed. So if open borders reduce suffering, then they are just. Nozick said, no, we can't just assume some omnipotent state that gets to allocate benefits and rain them down, as he put it, like manna from heaven is what he called it. Instead, he believed that the government's authority was narrowly limited to enforcing natural rights that people already have in the state of nature. And what this means, arguably, is that government can't just point to borders and say, those are our borders, we can do whatever we want, we can have whatever policy we want, unless the crossing of the border involves some violation of the rights of existing residents. The state has no business preventing it. So unlike Rawls and Singer, who were focused on what government must do to help the least advantaged, Nozick is focused on what the government may not do, with the argument being that it may not restrict freedom of movement or association across borders. And in that Joseph Cairns piece we talked about earlier in 1987, he summarizes what you call the Nozickian position on open borders. And he says, according to Nozick, the state has no right to do anything other than enforce the rights which individuals already enjoy in the state of nature. Note what this implies for immigration. Suppose a farmer in the United States wanted to hire workers from Mexico. The government would have no right to prohibit him from doing this. To prevent the Mexicans from coming would violate the rights of both the American farmer and the Mexican workers to engage in voluntary transactions. Even if the Mexicans did not have job offers from an American, a Nozickian government would have no grounds for preventing them from entering the country, so long as they were peaceful and did not steal, trespass on private property, or otherwise violate the rights of other individuals. Their entry and their actions would be none of the state's business. So that's the AF. Now, in terms of criteria and philosophy on the negative, it's a little bit more tricky in terms of your criterion and your philosophical grounding, but there are still, several good options. The first one would be just the idea of Kantian ethics and the ideal that the resolution fails Kant's most basic test. The basic argument here is that Immanuel Kant establishes a test for whether an action is morally right or just, and there are several aspects of it, but the most basic formulation of Kant's test is something you almost certainly heard of, which is the idea of a categorical imperative. And the question under the categorical imperative is, can this proposed action or course of acting or policy be made into a categorical rule that all actors should follow? And the idea here would be that no, it cannot. The particulars of the situation matter greatly to whether open borders are good or bad. A country that, doesn't have the economic wherewithal to support immigrants, opening borders to them could potentially be a disaster. A country that's not politically stable enough, where there's already conflict, letting in certain people who might make the conflict worse. In all these cases, specific factual questions about the particular circumstances affect whether or not open borders would be a good idea at a particular time. So the idea would be, if we apply Kant's test, open borders as a general rule would fail that test, and therefore we vote negative and reject the resolution because it cannot reflect a categorical rule. Now, there's a pretty common sense, intuitive case here that most judges will buy, and it's that, maybe there are some instances where open borders might be good, but there are also cases where countries simply don't have the resources to absorb large numbers of immigrants, or where immigration would overwhelm and destroy a small, fragile national identity or a small culture, or where better alternatives exist that are superior to open borders. And the argument is that, according to Kant and according to common sense, when you accept that these details matter to the outcome, that they could, at least in some cases, warrant a non-open border. Even if you think that might be a rare thing, even if you think in most cases open borders might be a good idea, you have already made the decision that justice does not require open borders. They may be one factor in the equation, but other things are factors as well. The second option, and the last option for the negative, is going to be what we call communitarianism. Communitarianism is this idea that rights and duties don't just attach to me and you as individual human beings, they also attach to communities of people. So Michael Walzer argued that for a community to have any rights or moral significance whatsoever, it first has to have the ability to define itself and its shared values and what it stands for. And this necessarily requires at least some right to exclude. So for example, let's use a non-political example. Imagine your debate team had no entry requirements. Anybody could just show up and participate and be a member. And that, the decisions on the team were made by democratic voting, right? Just majority rules. And so one day, a couple of dozen members of the marching band show up and say, hey, this is a nice room. We'd rather use this room to practice our instruments in. Well, if you as a debate team can't enforce your border, right? That is, if you can't decide who's part of the debate team, who's using your room during practice time, you don't really have an enforceable, defensible communal right. In other words, you don't have the right to be a debate team. Essentially, the entire purpose of your group goes down the drain without some right to exclude people who disagree with that purpose. Now, this is all summarized really nicely by Kabadu Mekonnen, I hope I'm saying that right, in a nice piece that actually sums up a number of arguments on both sides of the open borders debate. But he sums up Walzer's argument this way. Walzer asserts that questions of distributive justice presuppose a territorially defined world within which distributions take place. Self-determination is a core attribute of political communities without which there could not be historically stable communities of character with special commitment to each other and the aspiration to lead a common life for an indeterminate future. Citizens cannot exercise territorial jurisdiction against those with whom they share a territory. Doing so amounts to acting outside the sphere of justice and beyond their legitimate rights. In other words, the moral legitimacy of state borders is derived from equal treatment of all who live within. So let me explain what he's saying here. Communities have a right to determine what their values are. For example, you can say we're a country that believes in the rights of women. We're a country that believes in Catholicism. We're a country that believes in Islam. We're a country that believes in environmentalism, stopping climate change, whatever you want, right? Countries have a right to decide what their values are. But once someone is lawfully within your territory, right, according to Walzer, the right to exclude them, to ostracize them, to kick them out because they disagree with you goes away. We cannot force people in the United States or legitimately in any other country to share our values because that would be discrimination and tyranny. So the only place at which we have any check, any ability to steer our country toward any shared communal values, women's rights, environmentalism, Catholicism, Islam, whatever it is, the only place where we get to exercise any control is at the border. It's when we decide whether or not to let someone in based on whether we think they share our basic values or they don't share our basic values. Because once they're in, we no longer have a right to do that. So it's actually really important to respecting the rights within the country to ensure that we are having some control of whether people who come in have a basic agreement with us. So anyway, that was a fair bit on the philosophy and things like that, I know, but like I said, it's a really important aspect that you can't neglect. So now, without further ado, we move on to the contention level arguments on the AF. Okay, so affirmative arguments. Got a mixture of sort of philosophical and practical ones, a number of them to cover. So we'll jump right in with the first one, which is that open borders help the least advantaged. So earlier we talked about how Rawls was a good philosophical starting point for the AF. So let's start by applying some principles of Rawlsian justice, that is, helping the least advantaged first, as sort of practical impacts on the contention level. Now, to do that, the first thing you have to do is you have to sell the judge on just how wildly unequal the outcomes are for people around the world based on where they're born. Luckily for the AF, but unluckily for humanity, that is pretty easy to do. So to start with, we live in a world in which you can reliably predict how successful in financial and qualitative terms a person will go on to be just by knowing their country of origin. A Gates Foundation report in 2019 summarized things nicely, finding that where you're born is more predictive of your future than any other factor. This includes your education, your parents' education, your gender, your race, the field you work in, everything. Now, for a more detailed account of global inequality, we can look to, for example, the United Nations website. This is from 2020, just summarizing global inequality. It says the average income of people living in North America is 16 times higher than that of people in sub-Saharan Africa. Income inequality within countries is getting worse. Today, 71% of the world's population live in countries where inequality has grown. An Oxfam report shows that in the 10 years since the financial crisis, the number of billionaires has nearly doubled, and the fortunes of the world's super rich have reached record levels. In 2018, the 26 richest people in the world held as much wealth as half of the global population, down from 43 people holding that much wealth just the year before. The measurements and impacts of inequality go far beyond income and purchasing power. Inequalities of opportunity affect a person's life expectancy and access to basic services such as healthcare, education, water, and sanitation. They can curtail a person's human rights through discrimination, abuse, and lack of access to justice. In 2018, we saw the world's 12th consecutive year of declining global freedom, with 71 countries suffering net declines in political and civil liberties. The IMF has arguably an even better, sort of more quantitative summary. It says that the poorest half of the global population owns just 2,900 euros in purchasing power parity per adult, while the top 10% owns roughly 190 times as much. Income inequalities are not much better. The richest 10% snap up 52% of all income. The poorest half get just 8.5%. And while global inequality ebbs and flows a little bit statistically, the overall picture is that despite or because of greater overall wealth, it's about as bad as it's ever been in the modern era. The IMF study notes that global inequalities seem to be about as great today as they were at the peak of Western imperialism in the early 20th century. And of course, there are plenty of other sources you can find along these lines. They're not hard to find on your own. These are just a few samples. But the story we tell as the AF is that this kind of natural inequality is unbelievably unjust if those disadvantaged by it are unable to escape it, if they are literally locked into the places where this is occurring by the idea of borders. So how do open borders remedy this? Well, it's kind of obvious if you think about it. They give people the freedom to go where economic opportunity is rather than being restricted to a particular patch of ground where they happen to be born. So Katie Holmes of openborders.info in 2015 writes, in 2009, the United Nations Development Program determined that migrants who moved from low-income to high-income countries saw on average a 15-fold increase in income, a doubling of educational enrollment rates, and a 16-fold reduction in child mortality numbers. So that's a good overall summary. This improvement happens not just on the individual level, though, which is what Holmes is talking about, but also on the collective level. So looking to Branko Milanovic in the Financial Times in 2016, he talks about how open borders are the best way to alleviate poverty on the macro level. He says that migration does more to reduce global poverty and inequality than any other factor. Calculations done by Alan Winters of the University of Sussex show that even a small increase in migration would be far more beneficial to the world's poor than any other policy, including foreign aid. OpenBorders.info in 2015 talks about the Haitian example of migration reducing poverty. It says a significant fraction of people from poor countries have escaped poverty through migration. For instance, among those born in Haiti who are today not in poverty, 82% escaped poverty by leaving Haiti. In short, there is a ton of empirical evidence that lets you prove that when people move to where the opportunities are, they end up better off economically, they end up better off in terms of health, and so on. And so this is just a basic Rawlsian justice argument that removing barriers that confine lower income people to lower income countries is a fundamentally just thing to do because it is a way of helping the least advantaged get out of a bad situation. Now, a related argument is that open borders benefit everyone, economically and otherwise. So to sort of extend the arguments that open borders benefit migrants and to preempt negative arguments that they maybe hurt existing workers, which is something we will talk about later, it's a good idea to include some form of argument in your case that open borders don't just help the least advantaged, they actually make everyone better off, both migrants and existing populations within the destination country. And the way this works is fairly simple. It's the most basic sort of laissez-faire Adam Smith free market economic theory, and it holds that economies are most efficient when they are least restricted. When you let people make the deals that they want to make without barriers or regulations or taxes, or in this case, borders, they will make the best, most efficient deals for themselves, and the economy will grow. So Brian Kaplan, author of Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Migration, which we mentioned earlier, explains it pretty well. And this is a long quote, but I think it's pretty good. So let's just read it. Imagine you got 1 million people farming in Antarctica. Seems like a bad idea. They're eking out this bare subsistence in agriculture in the snow, he says. Obviously, if you let those farmers leave Antarctica and go someplace else to farm, the farmers are better off. But isn't it also better for the world if you let people stop eking out this existence, contributing nothing to the world, and go someplace they could actually use their skills to not just feed themselves, but produce something for the world economy? That's the basic argument for open borders, that you're moving productive resources, that is to say people, right? People and their labor, from places where they're next to useless to places where they can contribute a lot. The size of the numbers involved makes the case even more compelling. You might think that moving from Haiti to the United States was cause a 20% increase in wages, but no, it's more like a 2,000% increase in wages. In other words, 20 times, not 20%. The difference between the productivity of labor in poor countries and rich countries is so vast, it's really hard to wrap your mind around it. In other words, open borders free up literally hundreds of trillions of dollars worth of untapped potential. And this makes sense because developed countries just have the infrastructure, the capital, the education, the networks to let these people be productive, not just for themselves, right, but for the entire global economy, to make others better off in addition to themselves, and better than they would be able to do in the countries that they come from. Now, there are also some economic estimates that attach actual numbers to this general theory that Kaplan's talking about. So Paul Klein and Gustavo Ventura have a 2007 piece. And in it, these researchers find that simply by virtue of people being able to work and live where they want, open borders would increase annual global GDP by $100 trillion. Now, to be clear, since current global GDP is somewhere around $97 trillion annually, according to the World Bank in 2021, this is a greater than doubling of the world economy. This is as massive an economic impact as you'll ever see in debate. Of course, it's just an estimate because, there's no laboratory experiment where we can test it. But in a world where we measure growth in 3 or 4 or 5% a year and say that's pretty good, this is like a 104% boost. So you can really sell this as a potential game-changing impact in terms of meeting people's needs and wants, and really argue that this level of growth isn't just something that's good, it's arguably a moral imperative. It's so much more in terms of food and medicine and meeting people's needs and wants that you could argue that justice really does require something for this. Now, one important caveat is that this overall growth doesn't necessarily mean every person is better off. As we'll see later, Neg is going to argue that overall growth will come at the expense of unskilled workers in the destination country. But luckily for App, there's actually some evidence that while there may be some short-term pain, in the long run, open borders should benefit even lower skilled workers in the receiving countries. So this is from John Kennan, Open Borders in the European Union and Beyond. So John Kennan of the University of Wisconsin treats the European Union as a sort of natural experiment with how open borders work, and he explains the experiment this way. He says, in 2004, the European Union admitted 10 new countries, and wages in these countries were generally well below the levels in the existing member countries. Citizens of these newly admitted countries were subsequently free to take jobs anywhere in the EU. So it's basically like a form of open borders, and many did so. In 2015, a large number of refugees from Syria and other broken countries sought to migrate to the EU, and these refugees were met with fierce resistance, at least in some places. Anyway, and what Kennan finds is that when you factor in everything, including things like lower prices for goods, actual wage changes, all the economic factors, not just the actual amount you're paid in your paycheck, but what you can buy with it, for example. In the worst case scenario, the effect on real wages of native workers is basically zero, and at best, the gains to those workers are significant. He says, but the net gains from universally open borders estimated in Kennan 2013, he's citing himself, were roughly equivalent to doubling the income of an average worker in the average less developed countries. For unskilled workers in the poorest countries, that is to say, unskilled workers in the destination countries, the gains are in fact roughly equivalent to doubling the average income, meaning there's a large and permanent jump in the level of income. At the other extreme, for skilled workers in more developed countries, the gains are small. Taking Poland as a fairly representative example, the gain is 30% of income for unskilled worker and less than 10% for skilled workers. But still, even for skilled workers in a relatively high development country, you're seeing a 10% jump. Now, the bottom line here is that the economics of how open borders work on a macro global level and in a more micro local level are really key to understand. You have to be able to explain these as the app. But if you do, the app has a compelling argument that open borders would basically make everybody richer. In the long run, they would make, of course, the migrants better off than they were in impoverished countries. They make overall economies better off, but it wouldn't just be them. It would also be, in the long run, because the economy would be more productive, you'd see greater wealth for everybody involved, including even unskilled workers in the targeted countries. So that's an important economic argument to be able to make. The next argument I have on the list is closed borders unjustifiably violate the right to freedom of movement. So now let's shift gears a little bit from the more utilitarian economic arguments to some more philosophical rights-based app arguments. One of the first things we want to do here is get the judge thinking in terms of open borders or freedom of movement as not just a good idea, not just something that would be, nice, beneficial in a utilitarian sense, but as a right. When we successfully label something as a right in debate or anywhere else, it creates the notion that it's something that can't justly be taken away unless there's a really compelling and specific reason to do so. This is the idea, for example, behind John Stuart Mill's harm principle, which basically says that the only thing that a state can use its power to take away your rights for is specific identifiable harms to other people. In other words, we as governments don't like preemptively put people in jail for their own good because we think they might commit a crime. We don't silence free speech because we're vaguely worried that it might create some unspecified danger. And if we apply this principle that we don't go out and preemptively quash rights to the idea of freedom of movement, then the idea of aggressively enforced borders, where we just sort of preemptively tell huge classes of undifferentiated people, no, sorry, you can't go there, they seem like a real aberration if you believe that freedom of movement is a right. Now, of course, to make this work, we have to sell the judge on the idea that freedom of movement is, in fact, a basic human right on par with things like speech and other liberties. So AF is going to need to make that case, and there are a fair number of authors making the argument for freedom of movement as a fundamental right. So, for example, we can look to Freiman and Hidalgo. It may be Freeman, I'm not sure. It's spelled a little differently. But from 2016, they talk about freedom of movement as a basic human right. And they say that freedom of movement has value in virtue of the fact that it is a component of basic liberties. According to the standard liberal view, it is presumptively unjust for states to restrict people's freedom to pursue different occupational options and associate with people as they see fit. Freedom of occupation and association require freedom of movement. Suppose that the government prohibits you from, say, traveling to your place of employment or your local church. You have a right against government interference with your freedom of occupation and association, and to respect this right, government agents must refrain from interfering with your freedom of movement. If it was wrong for government agents to restrict your freedom of occupation and choice of restricting between, say, Newark in New Jersey and Los Angeles, it's hard to see why it would be permissible for state employees to restrict your freedom to move to, say, Vancouver. If occupational freedom and freedom of association require freedom of movement, these freedoms require freedom of international movement as well. So this justifies the right of freedom of movement in terms of like the freedom of work and occupation and freedom of association, your right to associate with other people, to work with people, to live with people, to interact with people. Another approach is to justify the right to a freedom of movement is that it is essential to a sort of right to self-improvement, self-enhancement, to sort of, in colloquial terms, follow your dreams and seek your purpose in life is a basic human right. So this is from Tom Ferrer in 2017, and it talks about the idea of the right to seek to improve oneself. And he says a second principle or normative premise which could support a right to enter is that no one should be denied the opportunity to lead a life with some opportunity for improvement and some measure of choice. Where grotesque inequality in life chances stemming from the accident of birth in a poor country can be radically mitigated by no more than acquiescence in entry, can persons who believe in the moral equality of all people bar the gates? I think it's important for aft debaters to be able to sell this idea that arbitrary restrictions on freedom and opportunity due to the accident of where you were born are just inherently unjust. I would use terms like some authors do, like segregation and apartheid. And I would ask, rhetorical questions, especially in more lay judge circuits, right? How is it morally any different to say to a person, you must stay in this impoverished little area your entire life because you happen to be born there? How is it any more moral to say that than it was to say in the South, say in the 1950s, you may not attend this good public school, you may not enter this store, you may not hold this office because of the color of the skin that you happen to be born with? Both are completely arbitrary. Both are not based on anything that the person has done. Both are random. People have no control over it. Both prevent people from acquiring a better life. So why is geographic segregation, and I would call it that, use that term, right, any different than, say, for example, racial segregation? But ultimately, regardless of how you do it, if you can establish that freedom of movement and freedom of migration are a basic human right, then you have gone not all the way, but I would say like 80% of the way to winning the round. So it's very important, even if you're running a really utilitarian, practical case, to be sure you're making some argument for a freedom of movement that is grounded in something other than just, the net benefits, in some fundamental conception of rights. Shifting gears again, there is the idea that open borders are the only way to remedy past injustices. So powerful countries have exploited less powerful countries and territories and people groups for as long as, countries have existed. There is an argument that the United States, for example, has effectively exported like ecological destruction. Our drug dependency has led to the formation of drug cartels. Our imperialistic ambitions around the world have destabilized countries and governments in all sorts of ways. And the argument here would be that these rich, powerful countries got rich and powerful in large part by number one, there's two things, but let's start with number one. Number one is creating negative externalities to the rest of the world. So European powers became wealthy by extracting resources from colonies all over the world that today are mostly less wealthy, less developed nations. The US and other rich countries industrialized long before other countries did, kickstarting climate change, which is a problem that affects everybody. And China is doing the same thing today. Now, when we talk about like domestic law, like the idea of torts, I'm a lawyer by trade. The idea is that when you create a negative externality that harms somebody else, like when you dump pollution in the river or whatever, you should have to absorb that, right? You should have to pay the cost for it to other people. And there's some decent literature out there that conceptualizes immigration as richer countries, in a sense, accepting responsibility for the harms that they've created and paying it back by allowing people in those countries to come reap benefits that they otherwise couldn't. But if we want an even more blunt version of this, you can get a really good version of it from Rhys Jones in 2016. We'll just pop it up on the screen, pause it, read it. It's a really powerful quote. In a more progressive circuit where your judges are maybe a little more progressive argument friendly, could go a long way. The core quote is at the bottom. You can see she's talking about the fact that Europe and the United States have carved up the world, drew the borders themselves, extracted resources, and basically left people in these little countries that they themselves drew the borders to with very little in the way of opportunity. And the conclusion is, rather than building walls and fences that force migrants to take ever more dangerous routes and result in thousands of deaths every year, the European Union must open borders and allow the free movement of human beings who are displaced by the history of European colonialism, arbitrary borders, and economic policies. The only just solution to a migration crisis of Europe's making is for Europe to take responsibility for the results. It is time for Europe to open its borders as a form of reparations for the past injustices that led to the crisis in the first place. And of course, it's not just Europe. For example, you can see here, Christina Lezzi notes that U.S. territorial acquisitions split up 36 different Native American tribes. So it happened in North America too. And there's really no way, perhaps other than open borders, at least you'd argue that there's no way to unwind and undo the centuries of arbitrary line drawing and exploitation that came from imperialism and colonialism. There's no amount of foreign aid that can fix dozens of generations of that. And we can actually link you to some sources where authors say that monetary reparations for colonialism aren't realistically ever going to happen. So there's one from Leah Coffino in 2020 called Migration as a Claim for Reparations. And, we're not going to read from that. But the basic idea is that the only just solution in a world where rich, wealthy, mostly Western powers, not entirely, went around dividing up the world, drawing the lines, lumping people together in borders where they didn't necessarily fit in terms of their history and their culture, and then extracting resources. The only solution to that in a practical, real world sense is to just say that all this system of borders, right, that you have created in this post-colonial world is unjust, and let the people who are still being affected by it come to your country and try their hand and do their best and see if they can benefit from some of the spoils that you extracted from that system. And I think it's a fairly compelling argument, like I said, particularly for more progressive circuits. And then finally on the AF, there's the argument that open borders don't require eroding national identity, culture, or language. Now, this may be more of a block or a defensive argument than like an affirmative contention, but I think it's potentially a really important one, so let's take a second and talk about it. Negg's main argument on a practical level is going to be that open borders will basically be taking away a state's ability to have self-determination. Basically, it'll take away the ability to have an identified culture, language, values, as well as to establish things like welfare policies, because there'll basically be like an infinite demand from everybody in the world on your welfare systems. And if you have a generous, say, system of public benefits, then everyone in the world will just come and take that. So it's just impossible to have open borders and a generous system with like high minimum wages and, leave laws and welfare payments for people who are disabled or out of work and things like that. You just can't have them both. And the basic answer that the app has to have, I think, is that it doesn't have to be that way. There are plenty of different options for what can happen to migrants and what rights and statuses they can have once they cross an open border. And nothing in the resolution and nothing in the real world requires, for example, that they receive the same social services as native residents or have the same say in political decisions as native residents. And while this may seem, and I would say probably is, somewhat discriminatory, AF's argument here would be don't make the perfect the enemy of the good, because it is far less discriminatory than the alternative of keeping people out entirely and forcing them to stay in an impoverished area. So we have a couple of sources here, and we'll just pop them up on the screen and you can read them and pause them if you want. One is from Branko Milanovic in 2016. The other is from an article, an interview at Reason magazine with Ken Pritchett in 2008. And both of them are just talking about how different countries, for example, like Kuwait, and others that they talk about, have systems where they allow lots of immigrants to come into the country and work, but don't necessarily afford them all the rights to welfare and political rights and things that you might see for native-born citizens. And the basic argument, that Pritchett says later in the interview, we don't have it, we didn't put it up on the screen, is that if you're worried about this creating a system of second-class citizens or second-class residents, that's a lot better than having these people remain like fifth-class human beings in a deeply impoverished country. So don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. All we have to do to affirm is let these folks come in and have some degree of opportunity, some maybe seek asylum from persecution, have a job where they cannot live in an absolute poverty wage. And if right now in the world we live in, we don't have full equity, we don't have like a one world government, and we can't give everybody the same political rights, okay, fair enough. Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. They're still better off in a country where they have somewhat more restricted rights to welfare, but they're not deeply impoverished. So don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. And so with that, that's a lot to process on the app, a lot of good, diverse arguments. We've only really scratched the surface. There are many more we could talk about, but just time limits us. So with that, let's switch gears and look to some arguments on the negative. Okay, so last but not least, arguments on the negative. On the neg, let's start with some core philosophical points and then move on to more practical considerations later on. So the first point I have on my list is there's no moral obligation to help strangers. So right at the outset, some negative debaters are going to want to challenge the core philosophical assumption of most AF cases, which is that there is some general justice-based obligation to help pretty much any person in the world who is experiencing hardship. The core of this attack is going to be the neg questioning assumptions on the AF, raising questions in the judge's mind about where exactly our obligation to help people with whom we have no clear connection, where does this come from? So, questions like, where does this duty to sacrifice potentially my interest to help strangers come from? Why am I obliged to, for example, open my doors to fix all of the bad luck or bad choices in the world? And most importantly, why does justice in particular, as opposed to say just, generosity or something else, why does justice in particular require that I do this? And as it turns out, there are several different types of arguments that there really is no obligation, absent some kind of special relationship, to help people with whom you have no connection. Now, the first form of the argument is not about open borders or freedom of movement in particular. Instead, it's just an argument that there is no general obligation whatsoever to resolve and fix the suffering of people that you're not connected with in some way. So this comes from Bob Corbett in 1995, and we'll just pop it up on the screen. I'm not going to read this, but as you can see, the basic argument on this is that if we did accept this notion that we have this general free-floating obligation to fix all the problems in the world, then basically we would be in a position of having to pretty much give up everything that we have above a basic survival and subsistence level. Singer, as we talked about earlier, Peter Singer admits this. He says that, yes, you would have a moral obligation to live at a poverty level and give everything else up. Nobody's going to do that. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to set moral obligations that literally no human being in the world would follow. And so what Corbett proposes is that the obligation to help others has to be narrower than this. It has to be something where we may have an obligation to those who are in some kind of relationship with us, maybe by virtue of being under the same government or something like that, or someone who we experience directly on a personal level, like we see someone drowning in a lake, for example. But more broadly, it would be, I don't have any general background obligation just because I'm a human being to solve the problems of every other human being. Absent some factor that creates a duty or an obligation that makes justice require something of me, I do not have such a justice-based obligation. What could create an obligation? Well, it could be something like a special relationship between a parent and a child. It could be a wrong that you have to right. So if you damage someone else in some way, you might have to pay them back. It could be a contract that you entered into. It could be the social contract. We live in the same country. We have consented to abide by the same laws. We pay our taxes, and thus we tacitly agree to maybe uphold obligations to one another. But absent any of these things, why do I have an affirmative duty to take action to assist other people for harms I did not cause? Do I owe you, for example, the right to come live in my home, to eat my food, to drive my car, to take money out of my bank account? Now, to be clear, we mentioned this earlier, nobody is saying that it wouldn't be morally praiseworthy to do these things if I did indeed say, let a needy person live in my house, eat my food, have my money. But like we said earlier, there's a major difference between saying something is praiseworthy and saying that it is required by justice. These things, most of us would agree that taking all the homeless folks in town into your home, or as many as you could hold, would be supererogatory, meaning they are morally good and praiseworthy, but nobody believes that they are required. And by the way, if you want a good background piece on what supererogatory morality is, we'll link to a piece from Jason Kowal that talks about just a general summary of the difference between mandatory and supererogatory actions. But the argument here is pretty simple. It's that if people in country A, assuming that they did not cause the problems of people in country B, and they did not enter into some kind of obligation toward them through some kind of agreement or deal, have no duty to assist people in country B. And that may sound kind of harsh, but philosophically speaking, it explains why, open borders don't exist anywhere in the world. Nobody believes that you're obliged to take every, unfortunate person into your home or into your city or into your country, because while it's a good thing to do, it's not a morally mandatory thing to do that's required by justice. Now, the second point I have is that there's no obligation to ensure freedom of movement. This is a somewhat narrower argument. It is a more specific and possibly stronger version of this sort of no duty argument, that even if there is maybe some generic duty to help all the people in the world, there's no specific duty to do it via opening the borders and allowing people to move unrestricted across them. On the app, we talked about the need to establish freedom of movement across borders as a fundamental right. But is it really a fundamental right? Well, right off the bat, the defining documents of international human rights say no, it is not. Both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights do address the idea of movement and freedom of movement, and they do say that there is a right to move within one's country and to leave one's country, but they expressly stop short of saying there is any right to enter another country. And there is not a single country in the world whose laws provide for an unfettered right of foreign nationals to enter. In other words, there's not a country in the world with a true open borders policy. So if we're looking for a legal or international law-based authority for some duty to permit freedom of international movement, it just does not exist. But okay, so what if, as the AF, we argue for just a normative perspective that such a right should exist, that some fundamental concept of justice is violated if I can't move across borders unrestricted and completely freely? Well, is that how anything works in the real world? To start with, I don't think it is, right? I'm not entitled to enter your home because you're wealthier than me or because it's raining outside. You're not entitled to enter the gated campus of a private college just because you would like to attend it. You are not entitled to walk into Disney World without a ticket. You are not entitled to walk into public government buildings like the U.S. Capitol without meeting certain criteria that the relevant authorities have set based on public interest. If it's too crowded on a particular day, they're going to stop the tours. You're not going to go into the Capitol. The fact that even if you're looking for work, that doesn't matter either. You are not entitled to walk into the campus of Facebook or Microsoft or into public locations like the Pentagon or a federal office building and go like door to door asking people for a job or for work to do. So this idea that there is a right to demand total freedom of movement, either in private spaces or in public spaces, is just not a real thing in the real world. Now, the AF will say, okay, fair enough. Hold on a second. These places you're talking about, these are limited areas. They're like buildings and campuses and things like that. It's different at a level as something as large as a town or a state or a country. We don't allow people to be excluded from like large areas like an entire state. Well, okay, it is generally true that we don't put up barriers around places like cities, but is that because of a fundamental right or entitlement, or is that because just how things worked out? Because they were the most convenient or the most logical for policy purposes. We know, for example, that privately owned communities are perfectly legal in the United States and most countries. You can buy up a bunch of land and you can effectively build a town. Mining companies had company towns. Private universities effectively function as their own towns and they can gate themselves off and not let people on their campus. Resorts are often like self-sufficient towns, gated communities, for better or for worse. They can all legally exclude people and they function just like municipalities in many instances. And as for states, yeah, it's true in the United States we don't restrict people from moving between states, but there are areas as large as states that can restrict you. For example, the largest landowner in the U.S. is a billionaire named John Malone, who owns 2.2 million acres, which is larger than the state of Delaware or the state of Rhode Island, and he absolutely has the right to and does restrict people from entering into those areas. And in addition, as we noted, other countries do restrict movement within the country. China does not allow totally free migration within its own country because it's worried that it might hollow out rural areas. So again, while we have a strong custom of generally letting people move freely within a country, it's not because of some inalienable right. It's because we, through our various governments, have made decisions. We have exercised our discretion and decided that this just happens to be the most convenient, logical rule for our purposes. But it is a default rule that we are free to alter, and we do alter in many cases, again, looking to the U.S. Capitol, looking to the Pentagon, looking to any private property. And yes, we might very well use different criteria and we might have a more egalitarian approach, a more open approach when it comes to borders than, say, getting into the U.S. Capitol, getting into Disney World. But that's not the question that the resolution asks. The question is whether, unlike every other space in the world, we have some affirmative duty to abolish essentially all controls and all discretion when it comes to national borders and recognize this duty, this justice-based requirement, this right that just as a practical matter doesn't exist. So as Adam Hussein explained in 2013, people often have an interest in moving to other countries, but not all interests are sufficient to generate rights, which would in turn generate obligations, in other words, justice-based obligations on the part of other people to satisfy them. For instance, perhaps you have an interest in getting a ticket to the cricket match tomorrow. That does not mean you have a right to one or that I ought to get you one. People only have rights, Miller proposes, to do what they need to do to lead a decent life. And Hussein explains that we can disagree as to what constitutes a need for a decent life, but again, once you agree that the government can engage in any decision calculus at all about who gets in, and like say, accept some people because they're truly needy and reject others because they're not truly needy. Once you agree with that premise, the debate's over. You have rejected open borders. And that is in fact what every country in the world actually has done, even the most progressive enlightened countries out there. So the next argument on my list is open borders will not alleviate poverty. This is going to be a response to AF's very likely claim that open borders will lead to both lower economic inequality and increased economic growth. And one common sense response is, well, there are open borders within the United States for people who are here lawfully. So why then do we still see incredible income disparities in this country between areas that are rich and poor? Why do people in small towns in the Mississippi Delta or the Rust Belt continue to live in desperate poverty, while a few hundred miles away in the suburbs of Dallas and Chicago, there's affluence? If borders are the problem and these people are free to move wherever the opportunity is, why hasn't inequality all but disappeared within the United States? And the answer, according to Borja Arnaiz, and I hope I'm saying that right, Arnaiz maybe, I don't know, in 2022, is that inequality is not a function of borders. It is just built into the social systems that we have. And if you look at this quote, we'll pop it up on the screen. Poverty and inequality precede borders, which, at least as we know them today, are a relatively recent invention dating back 3 centuries and a half to the Peace of Westphalia. To the extent borders are just one face of the problem, it does not seem that the solution lies in their opening, much less their removal. The problem consists above all in the political, economic, and legal framework that perpetuates an unequal distribution of wealth. And he goes on to argue that not only would open borders not solve for poverty and inequality in a system where it's sort of structurally built in to everything from, education to infrastructure to civil rights, it'll actually make the problem dramatically worse for the most disadvantaged in poorer countries. He says if borders are only a tiny part of that framework, it's unclear why their opening would be an effective, let alone definitive solution to the problems of global justice. At best, a world with open borders would be a world with greater mobility, one from which only some could benefit, usually the people best situated in their countries of origin, who are not the most in need. Consequently, it's difficult to see how this could help the poorest people who lack minimum resources and skills to migrate. And this is what we call the brain drain argument. And it's a pretty important one for the neg. You should really consider it for your case. I think it's a strong one that belongs in most sort of utilitarian leaning cases. And it's just the idea that if you open up immigration with no restrictions, yes, the winners will be professionals and wealthier young people in poor countries who can move, and the losers will be everyone else who's left there. The people in, say, a small African or East Asian country who can't just up and move, which is to say most people. The elderly, the disabled, the people who take care of them, the people who lack the money, the people who lack marketable skills. There are literally billions of people who, no matter what you do with open borders, are still going to live in these countries. And they're going to see things like seeing their doctors up and leave, their engineers up and leave, their teachers up and leave. And consequently, they will all be much worse off for having done open borders. Robert Longley points out in 2022, for example, that in 2010, there were more Ethiopian doctors living in Chicago than there were living in Ethiopia. And brain drain is such a serious problem that it can create perverse incentives not to educate your own people. So Joseph Scarvelis in 2016 notes that a 2013 study found that the effects of brain drain are so strong that increased expenditure on education in these developing countries, in fact, negatively correlates with human capital formation, because the more they educate people, the faster they leave to go to the UK, to go to the United States, to go to other wealthier countries. Now, there's a really nice article on this with a lot of credibility because it comes from a scholar in a country, Ghana, that is actually experiencing the brain drain problem. It's by Emmanuel Ifeanyi-Ani, and I probably got that wrong. Emmanuel Ifeanyi-Ani. I'm really sorry I botched that, but it's a great piece. So as badly as I'm done with the name, this author did really, really well with the piece. And what it says is what open borders would do is to open borders not just to medical skills, and he's been talking in the piece about how doctors are leaving these countries, but to just about anyone with medical skills or others, We are not here talking about people with just health skills, but the entire lower middle class, as well as much of the general middle class. And then he talks, as you can see here, about how many physicians have been lost already in a world without open borders, and talks about how that would just be exponentially higher in a world where there were literally no barriers to going to these countries. In addition to these terrible economic consequences of brain drain, Ani argues that there would be massive negative political consequences too. And as you can see here, we're not going to read all of this because it's very long, but he has this very good card in which he argues that these relatively skilled middle class folks in these developing countries tend to be the people who are most interested in pushing for democracy and political stability and moderation, whereas the very powerful and the very poor tend to either be apathetic or more in line with, for example, authoritarian governments. So when you take away these skilled, better educated middle class folks and send them off to the UK and the US and other places, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be seeing a significant decline in the values of political progressivism and liberalism, and making these places even worse off, not just economically, but socially as well. And so at the end of the day, the brain drain argument is a powerful way to say, look, all of these economic benefits you're talking about, they're a zero-sum game. The rich will get richer, and yes, that will include some migrants who will definitely have better lives, but the poor countries will still exist. They'll still have billions of people in them, and they will have been effectively strip-mined of professionals in the middle class, like we see going on in places here in the United States, like the Mississippi Delta and the Rust Belt towns in America that got hollowed out when young people moved to big cities. So in addition to that, the second major argument against economic benefits of open borders is the harm to existing workers in destination countries. And there's plenty of empirical data on both sides here, but a really nice lay judge-friendly card comes from George Borges, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, from 2016. This is a Harvard professor of economics, so a credible source. And as you can see here, we talk about how a 10% increase in the number of workers with a particular skill set lowers the wage of that group by about 3%. He goes on to talk about how overwhelmingly when we talk about lower skilled jobs, unfortunately because of systemic historical issues in this country, in the United States, we're talking about hurting many people of color, Black people and Hispanic people who've suffered the most from the wage dip, and the monetary loss is sizable, as you can see, he says. You're talking about a person with a $25,000 income losing between $800 and $1,500 a year. And there's even greater empirical support for this. For example, from the UK, this is a card from the Oxford University Migration Observatory, and it talks about how, a 1 percentage point increase in the ratio of immigrants to non-immigrants leads to a 0.6% decrease in wages. So, if that's 1% and you started talking about massive unfettered migration under open borders, you can imagine just how much that would drive wages down. And then coming back to Borges, he goes on to argue that large-scale immigration adds strain to social services and ultimately results in a net wealth transfer from poor workers to basically rich CEOs. He says that immigrants receive government assistance at higher rates than natives. The higher cost of all the services provided to immigrants and the lower taxes they pay because of lower earnings inevitably implies a year-to-year basis immigration creates a fiscal hole of at least $50 billion, a burden that falls on the native population. What does it add up to? The fiscal burden offsets the gain from the $50 billion immigration surplus, so it's not too far-fetched to conclude that immigration has barely affected the total wealth of natives at all. Instead, and this is really key, it has changed how the pie is split, with the losers, the workers who compete with immigrants, many of those being low-skilled Americans, sending roughly a $500 billion check annually to the winners. And remember, one key to being a good debater is taking these abstract numbers and ideas and putting them in clear, memorable, impactful terms for your judge. So the story here is that open borders are not a magical solution to poverty. It is just another free market, laissez-faire capitalist tool that gets you winners on one hand and losers on the other. And in the receiving country, the winners are the CEOs and the losers are the poor, unskilled workers. And in the net losing people exporting countries, right, the less developed countries, the winners are the young and educated who get to leave, and the losers are everybody else, the relatively poor there too. So basically, this is the quintessential rich get richer, poor get poorer, laissez-faire capitalist scheme. And yes, it might make the world richer overall, right? Raw, unregulated, unfettered capitalism does tend to do that. But as with everything capitalism does, the wealth is going to be going mainly to the better off, and the people at the bottom of the distribution are going to be worse off than they were before. So you may like that kind of policy if you are a CEO, but please do not presume to stand here and tell me that a rich get richer, poor get poorer policy like this is something that justice requires, because it is not. Now, another point that's semi-related to this, it's kind of a curveball argument, is that justice actually requires us to close borders to those who are not actually in need. And it may be more of a block than a contention, but it's just something worth thinking about. If AF tries to justify open borders in terms of resource distribution and fairness, like the Kantian case that we talked about earlier, like the Peter Singer case that we talked about earlier, there's a pretty easy way to turn that whole line of argument back against the AF. And the response is, look, if you're basing your justification of open borders on the needs of the migrant, well, then it's really going to depend on who the migrant is and what they need and what they plan to do. And if it depends on who the migrant is, and you get to ask questions and make decisions based on who they are, then you don't have open borders. So if we look at this quote from, this is again from Borja Arnaez from 2022, if justice is concerned with the needs of the disadvantaged, just as it would not be morally wrong to prevent a rich person from entering a soup kitchen or deny her the minimum subsistence income, to what extent would a government act badly if it forbade her entry into the country? Distributive justice, by its very nature, requires us to put needs in order of priority and to give some, the most pressing, preference over others, the least pressing. Now, so imagine a person who has got a job, is perfectly capable of working in country A, and in fact, has a decent job that provides for their needs. They look at country B in an open borders world, and they see that country B has more generous welfare benefits, and they decide, you know what, I'm just going to go there to country B, and I'm going to get on their welfare dole, right? And I'm going to start getting welfare payments, and I won't have to work, or maybe I'll have to work a lot less. I won't have to work as hard as I do here. I'm going to enjoy those welfare payments. Does country B have a justice-based obligation to let that person in? Is there a distributional fairness basis for letting that person in? No, not at all. That person already has what they need. They're planning on coming to country B and putting more strain on the welfare system, which is a limited resource that is supposed to benefit people who actually need it. Right? And we certainly are not saying as the neg that most migrants in an open borders world would be people who are just coming to freeload like this. But if you just agree that a country ought to be able to have some screening process, any screening process whatsoever, and this is really important, this is a theme you need to keep coming back to as the negative. If you believe there should be any way to screen for any number of people who want to do this, right? For example, to ask, do you have a plan for employment? What was your employment like in your country of origin? What was your income like in your country of origin? If you believe there should be any way to differentiate to keep people who want to come and just basically, live easy lives as opposed to people who genuinely need it, then at that point you have rejected open borders, because any substantial restrictions, any differentiation means we are not talking about open borders. Last substantive argument I have is that the right to association requires the right to exclude. And this shifts back to sort of the fundamental rights question. And one pretty strong argument on this is that borders in some form are necessary to the right of association because the right of association requires some level of a right to exclude. The right to association is essential for human beings to carry out their collective goals and ambitions and to achieve self-actualization. This goes back to the communitarian philosophy we talked about earlier. You can't have a debate team if the kids who want to play their band instruments can just come in and you can't tell them to leave, if you don't have some form of borders, right? Now, you do have to be careful with this argument about like self-determination and exclusion, because if you phrase it wrongly, it can quickly veer into problematic, it's sort of even racist sounding territory where you sound like you're talking about like cultural superiority and things like that. But you don't have to do it that way. In fact, and of course you shouldn't. Phrase it more neutrally. For example, imagine you are a progressive country that protects women's rights, in particular the right to abortion. And your immigration officials tell you that there are millions of people who are devoutly religious in some religion in the neighboring country that would like to immigrate. And if you opened your borders, they would do exactly that. And they would quickly become the majority in certain regions of the country within a few years. And when they did, it is highly likely that they would ban abortion and restrict women's rights in those areas where they were the majority. Are you obliged by justice to just let that happen? Well, most people would say no. You are not required to tell women in your country, sorry, there's nothing we can do. You don't get to keep your rights. This goes to ideas like national self-determination and sovereignty, the right of a people to collectively chart their own course within their own sphere. And yes, of course, sovereignty should be limited by respect for fundamental rights, but this particular right, and by the way, we talked earlier about how it's highly dubious that this is a right at all, but this right of movement essentially requires you as the country to relinquish your control over everything else. If you truly have no discretion over who comes in, looking back to sort of the Walzer piece about communitarianism, then you don't have any control over your policy making. You don't have any control over your welfare allocations or your language or your culture or anything, because if the world decides they want what you have or they want to change what you do, and enough people feel that way, there's literally nothing you can do to stay the course and keep consistent with your rights. There also are some more specific arguments that we don't really have time to get into about how limiting immigration is necessary to preserve common culture. There's a good piece, for example, from David Miller that we'll see in the notes, 2015. We'll pop it up quickly on the screen here. And it just talks about how you don't have to believe in cultural superiority or anything like that your culture is perfect to understand that there are benefits from having shared common culture, right? There are benefits from having a culture that most people share, and at minimum you may want to have some time and some leeway to limit or delay massive immigration to make sure that those common cultures persist. Now, Miller states this in very calm academic terms, but let's be real here about like the chaos and bloodshed that could easily flow from open borders. And this is where you start talking and getting real with the judge. There's a reason no country in the world has open borders. Look at the United States. Look at all these militia groups and right-wing nativist groups and these people who show up at the border armed with AR-15s because they think that immigrants are invading this country. And look at the president we recently elected who ran on a platform of demonizing immigrants, calling migrants rapists and murderers. Do you seriously believe that if we somehow in the United States magically declared open borders tomorrow, that we wouldn't see something kind of akin to civil war? Do you think we wouldn't see militias and paramilitary groups lining up and trying to attack people and shoot them at the border? Do you think we wouldn't see southern red states like Texas and Florida making very serious attempts to secede from the Union? Do you think we wouldn't see Republican-controlled cities and states setting up like checkpoints and trying to drive out and intimidate immigrants? We've already done that, right? We've seen Texas and Florida pack immigrants up on buses and planes and try to ship them off as a political stunt to DC and Martha's Vineyard. But the takeaway here is really simple. It's not just self-determination and sovereignty that are inherently valuable. They are. But just as importantly, if you take them away via open borders, there is a massive potential for political backlash. And then I said lastly earlier, but I actually have one more, which is that open borders facilitate colonialism and imperialism. This is a little bit of a squirrel type argument and a change of pace, but I like it a lot. And basically it goes like this. In a debate about open borders, we tend to focus on the marginalized people coming to rich countries because that's what's happening a lot right now. And that feels sort of fair and just. But if we're making the stronger claim that justice requires open borders, then we are establishing a rule that should apply universally. Justice is not, whether something is a good idea right here, right now. It's rooted in fundamental, unchanging obligations. And if we hold aft to that standard, the idea of this sort of almost God-given right to move wherever you want on earth can be used, and in fact has been used, to justify things like colonialism and imperialism, to justify wealthy powers sending their people and their values and their culture into less developed spaces to exploit their resources and gradually bring them under their sway. And so there's a very good card here, as you can see, from Carl Martin Adam in 2018. And I'm not going to read all of this, but what it basically says is that the very same ideas that are used today to justify philosophically open borders in the world we have now, with mainly more impoverished people mainly moving to richer areas, they're the same arguments that were frequently used to justify things like colonialism. And you could actually argue that many of the migrants that were coming, for example, to North America, right, during the colonial period, during the sort of manifest destiny westward expansion period, many of them were poor. Many of them were people who were going out to set up a farmstead and things like that, but they were the ones who were running Native Americans off of their land. And the same argument that you can't tell the poor to stay where they are, they have to be able to go out into the world and there should be no restrictions on freedom of movement. Those are arguments that are very troubling and could, absolutely justify, a more sort of colonialist approach to the world. And the argument would be, look, Judge, if you want to sign on to the idea that the United States and maybe the EU should have open borders right now in 2023, fair enough. But the resolution doesn't say that. It asks you to go much farther than that. It asks you to sign on to this essentially unchanging principle of people being able to go out and chase their manifest destiny wherever with no restrictions on their movement. And the cultures and governments that others set up, like Native Americans, with African victims of colonization, they should have no real ability to stop them ever as a general rule, because there's this unchecked right to go wherever in the world you want to go and to live wherever you want want to live. And you would say justice does not require, for example, that China be able to send 1 million of its people to Namibia or the Dominican Republic, set up businesses, buy up natural resources, vote in pro-Chinese officials. It doesn't require local authorities to sit by and smile and fail to put up any barriers whatsoever when that sort of cultural imperialism is happening. And that's what happens when you say that justice requires it. Okay, so final thoughts. I know that this is a really important topic. Some of you are going to be trying to qualify for like NSGA nationals, maybe NCFL nationals with this topic. Some of you are going to try to, get qualifications to Tournament of Champions and things like that. It's a really important time of year. So just 2 quick things to carry with you as you go out. Number 1, remember, be sensitive to all sides in this debate. Don't lose a debate that you should win, and just don't be a jerk by being insensitive to the very real struggles of both migrants and also people in target countries who worry about their wages and their future if immigration becomes, much larger than it is today. Be sensitive to that, be logical, right? But remember to be sensitive. With that said, though, as long as you're careful with how you phrase it, do use powerful terminology. Terms like, for example, apartheid or segregation based on where you were born. Those are things that have the potential to sort of cut through a lot of the clutter and a lot of the rhetoric and the numbers in the round and stick in the judge's mind because, no matter how many rounds a judge has done, no matter how advanced and technical they are, they're tired. They want to get a clear, simple picture of why they vote for you, and good, charged, informative but emotional rhetoric like that lets you have an advantage there. Lastly, just remember this is a topic that requires both a philosophical and a practical element to it. So do not neglect to lay the philosophical groundwork. Be able to explain, not just read in your case, but explain in your own words exactly why you are linking to some conception of justice. Why does justice require this on the app and on the neg? Why does justice either not require it or perhaps potentially even prohibit it? And then move on to explaining whatever the practical impacts are and why they matter to that, but don't leave out that philosophical understanding, because good debaters will hit you on that. Particularly negative debaters will come in and hit the app by saying, okay, fine, this is a good idea. Maybe a lot of countries should do it, but why is it the only thing we can do? Why is it something that justice mandates in every single case? So those are a couple of thoughts to take with you. I, again, think it's a fantastic topic. I wish I were debating it, but you guys are. So have a lot of fun. If you're going to big tournaments with it, trying to qualify, trying to win, those big trophies and stuff, best of luck to you. We'll see you back here in March. And so with that, we will close with what we always say, which is debate is for everybody. So remember to work hard, have fun, and Hail State.